Assalamualaikum listeners. Before we start the show, I wanted to remind you guys of a very, very exclusive offer, which is essentially our Patreon WhatsApp Boys in the Cave chat that, mashallah, like, alhamdulillah, I think it's probably one of the best WhatsApp threads you can be on in history, to be honest, because like the amount of, mashallah, like knowledgeable people that are there, because we do add our guests from the show onto that chat, as well as our very insightful listeners that are Patreon members who are on the chat as well. There's mashallah, very amazing discussions happen. So we have the sort of guests that we do have on the Patreon WhatsApp chat is the likes of Dr. Jonathan Brown, Asadullah Ali, Dr. Samir Mahmood, Tariq Tamar. We also have the likes of, Mohammed Taba, Mohammed Ishaq, and many, many others as well. So you definitely don't want to miss out such an opportunity. So we have even sheikhs on it, like Sheikh Omar Baloch, Sheikh Osta, for example. So you definitely don't want to miss this opportunity to be in the same chat as such wonderful thinkers and brilliant minds and the sort of discussions that we have. So if you want to be part of the inside conversations, definitely join our Patreon page, our $5 Patreon tier. Inshallah, you can join us in the WhatsApp group. So all you have to do is go patreon.com/boys in the cave. It's $5 Patreon tier, and at the same time you're also benefiting our project to keep on going smoothly, and at the same time also better our production quality, and inshallah we can improve better and then think about going into video, and that can only be done through your help. So inshallah, I hope people jump onto that and look into that, and also at the same time benefit BITC. So thanks for that, and I'll get into the show inshallah. So hope you enjoy the show.
And I'm also like teaching this class at the Islamic Seminary of America with Yasser Qazi, and that's taking time.
I saw that. How's that going? I saw a bit of it because
really
I'm trying to start this online course stuff up as well. So I'm in the works. So I was just sussing out all the ones that are out there. So I saw that one. Seems pretty legit, like proper, like formal and stuff.
Yeah, it's very good. We're co-teaching it, so he definitely does more of the administrative work. But even that little bit of administrative work and then the teaching time is really kind of. This is a tough semester, really a tough semester. But alhamdulillah, it's at least it's a good problem. These are good problems to have, and
Fair
maybe
enough,
just means I have to cut down.
Appreciate
on,
you coming on. I know, as you mentioned, it's just pretty full on from your end, but yes, regardless, thank you for coming on and stuff. I know. I mentioned it sort of last minute, but I guess like last time, alhamdulillah, like when we did the last episode, it was really good. I personally enjoyed it a lot, but I guess some viewers wanted because we didn't actually end up covering what we wanted to, which was it was like a tangent that went into a nice tangent, and then we just went with the flow essentially. So alhamdulillah. So that's why we wanted to sort of also cover some stuff. I guess me and Raf wanted to ask you about, especially like I guess expertise wise, like your book as well, the books that you wrote, like Misquoted Muhammad Sallallahu and also I guess some political stuff. So I was just wondering if we could maybe get into that inshallah. But because it was funny when I was prepping for the last episode, but which I didn't end up asking the question for, was I think you went on this BBC show, right? It was like audio only show. I think the guy's Tom Holland. He's like the mad revisionist type. And it's interesting because I think he has a PhD and all that. And you guys are talking, and this guy's like total, like, I don't know what his aqidah is or whatever, but man, he's saying some weird ass stuff about the deen. And it's just like, it seems like full concocted. Like he's just kind of making up things on the fly and sort of presenting it as if it's like legit. And he probably has done a paper on it. I don't know how common that sort of perception is when it comes to hadith, or actually I'll get into that a bit later, but what's your sort of thoughts on that show and Tom Holland in general? Because I don't know, I think it was a while back, to be honest.
Yeah, it was a couple of years ago. If you hear clinking and stuff, it's just because I'm getting teacups out. It's either podcast with me doing stuff or no podcast. So that's just for your
No, it's so
listeners.
good.
Sorry, listeners. That's just the way it works.
It's multitasking, mashallah.
Well, I'm actually terrible at multitasking, but there's basic stuff I can do, like get teacups down. I think. Okay, now I'm going to go to another room and I'm going to fold laundry while I talk to you. The Yeah, so basically, he's Tahal, I think he has a PhD in classics. I mean, he's actually a very accomplished classicist, kind of Greco-Roman stuff, and I know he translated Herodotus, I think he translated the Herodotus, yeah. But anyway, but his perspective is actually quite representative of just a sort of a Orientalist view. And I think it's if your listeners are interested in this and reading more about it. Sorry, I'm just going to close this and put my computer on Do Not Disturb because I'm doing this through my computer. If your listeners are interested in this, I wrote something which is actually chapter either 9 or 10 of my book on Hadith, and I basically cut out a section of it with an introduction, and I put it on Yaqeen. I think it's called Blind Spots. Maybe you can find this. Just Google like Jonathan Brown Blind Spots Yaqeen or something. You'll find it. And it's basically a history of the Western historical critical method. In effect, it's a history of how modern Western people came to think the way they do about the past, and especially about religion. So when we talk about religion, why is it that we always assume that religions are made up, that they develop over time, that scripture is fake or made up? It can't go back to its original, to when it claims it actually comes from. And so you have to understand where that view comes from, and it comes out of a specific, Western European Christian experience with the texts of the classics, like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and then the biblical tradition and the history of Christianity. When basically I won't go into details, but basically by the around early 1800s, it had become very evident that a lot of the texts that Western Christians and Western people had thought were, authentically and reliably traceable back to their authors in whether the classical Greco-Roman past or the biblical tradition, were in fact either later productions or were texts that had come in to taken form over many either centuries or many decades, and had bore the marks of lots of chefs, right? Lots of chefs were involved in cooking the broth, so to speak. And so there grew this assumption among Western, especially German and then later French and British and American scholars in the 19th century, that this was just the case for all world religions, that basically all world religions were, cultural productions that took place over time. And there's certainly their scripture, certainly their beliefs and dogma emerged over time. And orthodoxy is something that a religion isn't born in its orthodox form, right? It's born in some kind of weird heretical form, or what's later considered heresy. And then that is sort of glossed over and reshaped as you get an organized religion which decides on its own beliefs and stuff, and then it kind of goes back and covers up its past and retells its own sacred history of itself. And the scripture is also similarly kind of massaged and manufactured and edited. So the assumption is that that's the case for Islam. And literally, I mean, certainly the study of early Islam and Islamic law and stuff really came through as an extension of Western studies of the biblical tradition, because Arabs were just like another group of Semites that you could study to kind of better understand the ways of the Israelites and the biblical tradition. And a lot of the people who were the earliest and most accomplished Western scholars of the origins of Islam, like Julius Wellhausen, who died in 1918, or the Hungarian scholar Ignaz Goldziher, who died in 1921, they were literally people who did biblical studies, and then they just as a kind of side job or later career choice decided to study the origins of Islam. So what that means is that so in one sense you have to understand where they're coming from, And you can see this very clearly with Tom Holland. I mean, I don't want to badmouth the guy, but I mean, he has a
You're free
certain.
reign to do so if you
Yeah, but I
want.
mean, I
On
don't
Boys in the Cave, it's all right.
just I don't want to be, I don't want to be unnecessarily biased or anything. But I mean, if you put it this way, if you watch Tom Holland's videos or listen to him, I mean, he is an elite British. Um, I call them like tipsy Nigels. I don't know if it's a insulting, but it's sort of like, you run into them at a cocktail party and they say, well, I was just reading the latest issue of the Royal Society, and I have a very interesting discovery they've made in Jordan. And apparently, the entire Quran was written in Syria in the year 1300. And then, these chaps, they really ought to understand what they're doing is complete nonsense. So you can imagine like that kind of, you can having that kind of conversation. You'll be like, yeah, that's really interesting, Nigel. But maybe you should lay off the cocktails. But I mean, it's a mixture of like cultural arrogance and the assumption that the entire world, except for you, is just sort of lost in the darkness. And you know where you can see this is really like something like Indiana Jones, movies like Indiana Jones, the novels of Rider Haggard, which by the way, I love those novels. I love Indiana Jones too. I'm such a like a colonialist or something. You ever read Rider Haggard's novels like King Solomon's Mines, Alan Quatermain? Like a bunch of British people go and figure out that, there's like the old like cartoon, the old, Tarzan serials they made in the 1940s and 30s and 40s, where like these white hunters would go into the jungle and get captured. And then they would realize they would look in their almanac and they'd find out there was an eclipse happening. So they'd be like, I will make the sun disappear. And then all the natives are dancing around and let them go. So that's the kind
You know
of
you're about to be
attitude.
cancelled. You're not
What?
about to be cancelled for liking colonialist
No,
films.
I mean, I don't care. I seriously, I've
You
always
don't
people
care.
already tried to cancel me for I like Indiana Jones. I don't care about that. These
That was
movies are
my
great.
childhood, Indiana Jones. Like I just can't manage to find in my heart the disdain for Indiana
Yeah,
Jones
of
after
course.
how
This
many
is this
times
is
I
good
watched
stuff.
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
It's six. That's that guy's PJs. Okay,
We'll
so
take
basically,
the anti-Nazi part out of it and just leave the rest. We'll just be
wait.
quiet
So
about the
you
rest.
you don't like the anti-Nazi part? And
No,
now
no, I
you're
said
gonna get
I
canceled.
meant
Now
I
you're
meant I meant
you're gonna get canceled.
gee,
So what you're
someone's gonna
saying is,
crop
so
that.
what you're saying is, wait,
Yeah.
I want to be very clear. You're not saying you like Nazis. You don't like Nazis. You
No,
like the
no. To
fact
be
that they're the
clear,
bad
yeah,
guys.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
My grandfather was thrown in jail for being a partisan and fighting against the Nazis. So not to say that
In
that
in
necessarily
Italy,
means
are you the Italian one?
yeah. I am the Italian one. Yes,
Raphael.
yes. I remember there was I think that you were chatting with Maheen on Man Mamluk's podcast, and was there something about how I didn't wake up on time for an episode? And then I remember you just briefly said, "Oh, is that the Italian guy?" And so someone sent me that and said, "Hey, look, Dr. Jonathan Brown kind of knows who you are by name."
Yeah, because we
kind of.
talked about the leper. Remember?
We did,
Anyway,
yeah.
the point is, you guys are distracting me. The point is, we were talking about Tom Holland, right? So you have to
Yeah.
understand this perspective. It's in one sense, it comes out of a a tradition's realization that its own origins are sort of made up, right? And and then they just assume that's true for everybody, and that they are going to go and kind of help everyone around the world free themselves from this prison of the past. Why are you going to be a prisoner to these weird, bogus religions that you follow when you can be enlightened and Western, and maybe not even Western, but don't be prisoners to your own past, right? So that in one sense, like you have to understand that one could call that an altruistic or a quote unquote enlightened perspective. But then part of it also comes from colonialism, and when you conquer
Mm.
the entire world, you automatically assume that you're in a position to judge those people and tell those people about their own lives and their own tradition, right? So that's you have to understand the perspective of this scholarship, and that's really what there's not too much of that now in Islamic studies, and now Islamic studies and Middle Eastern studies and religious studies, I think, has other problems. It's not so much a Western centric sort of Orientalist problem as it is a now it's more of a deconstruction and kind of progressivization activistization of scholarship, that where everything doesn't really matter what's reliable or true or good arguments anymore. It's just a matter of what fulfills certain sort of social justice agendas. But anyway, so let me finish. Sorry, I keep don't get me on another tangent, or you won't. The same thing will happen that happened last
Oh, it's
time.
a good tangent. It's all right. It's all right.
Yeah. So, but then a good way to understand this is that the idea that religions change and that scripture is not as it couldn't have sort of arrived in its original and lasting form, that it had to go through some kind of significant editing process. This becomes essentially an article of faith. It's almost an article of dogma for Western scholars of religious traditions. And so they just assume they assume that it has to be the case that the Quran did not actually come from the time it says it comes from, that it has to have undergone serious change over time. And so they'll concoct whatever bizarre argument or chain of argumentations they have to arrive at that conclusion, even if it means ignoring the best evidence, right? So a good example of this is with Tom Holland with his, and I wrote an article about this, is in his book, The Shade of the Sword. He says that, the Muslims basically got the 5 daily prayers from Zoroastrianism. And his argument was that, so of course, they say, well, Muslims we don't have early Islamic history written down. It's only written down, in 150, 200 years later at the earliest. But, so how we have to go and figure out what their original version of their religion really was. Where did they get this stuff from? So he says they got it from Zoroastrianism. What's his evidence? His evidence is I think it's a 12th century Jewish text from Spain, which turns out actually to be partially fraudulent anyway, and that's discovered in like the 19th century. But it's a 12th century text from Spain, quoting an 8th century rabbi in Iraq. Okay, so mind you, remember, what's Muslims' problem with their history is that they didn't write their history down for, let's say, 150, 200 years. So how do we solve that? We go to a guy in Spain in 1200, so fully, 600 years after Islam starts. But it's okay, because he's quoting an earlier figure from the 700s. Mind you, if a Muslim quotes an earlier figure, it's not allowed. But this guy's quoting this rabbi from the 700s, who says what? He says that when Zoroastrians convert to Islam, a lot of them didn't stop drinking immediately. Okay, fine, whatever. This is not new, but it has nothing to do with the 5 daily prayers. Nothing. So this whole what is it? This there's no evidence for this, and yet you have in the Muwatta, which is an early, one of our earliest surviving texts in Islam from the late, the mid 700s of the Common Era, right? It talks about the 5 daily prayers. So you have there's a Chinese traveler, I think, who's in Kufa and Basra in the 700s. He talks about the Muslims go to pray 5 times a day. So you have all sorts of evidence, which is reliable historical evidence, that Muslims have these 5 daily prayers. But but he's insisting that it comes from Zoroastrianism, even though his evidence actually doesn't even talk about the 5 daily prayers. So this is an example where the thing is that oftentimes these kind of Orientalists and Neo-Orientalists are asking you to believe about the origins of Islam with whatever theory they've cooked up. What they're asking you to believe is actually far harder to believe and far more of a stretch of even a secular imagination than just believing that the Quran comes from the mid 600s in the Hijaz, and there was a guy named Muhammad who thought he was a prophet, right? Like, whether you want to believe it's revelation or he was a real prophet, that's up to people. That's people's choice, right? But the fact that this actually comes from the time and the place it says is not an insane thing. It's how bizarre is that? Especially since I just got in this debate a couple of days ago on Twitter. I couldn't believe it. By the way, Muslims need to stop watching this crap. I don't know what is. Do Muslims have like no taste or no discrimination in what they watch on YouTube? Because I kept getting contacted by these young Muslims. They're like, I just watched some guy, like a video on YouTube where he spends an hour talking about how Islam actually started in Petra in Jordan and not in Mecca. And I was like, why did you watch
Patricia
this stuff?
Crone's thesis.
Yeah, no, that's not even Patricia Crone's thesis. Sometimes. That's not even. This is no one believes this nonsense. Okay, in fact, there's a really good scholar from an Israeli guy named Michael Lecker wrote a review of this thesis of this book and just trashed it. I mean, viciously. I mean, he was polite, but he just torpedoed it completely. The point is that, we have, I said, look, there's non-Muslims, books by non-Muslims written in the 660s, the Common Era, the 670s, 680s, 690s, where they literally talk about Muslims have this shrine in Arabia, in Mecca, and they say the Muslims in different parts of the world pray in this direction toward this place, right? In the Hijaz. And they say that the Prophet Muhammad lived there and he traveled from there when he was a child to Syria on trade and things like that. And, so my point is that not only let's say you don't want to believe anything Muslims write because we'll say Muslims are unreliable. Even non-Muslim sources would show you that this religion or whatever, this movement originated in the Hijaz in the mid 7th century. Anyway, so that's my response to this stuff, is that you have to understand that it's really about getting Muslims to adopt a certain cultural attitude towards their religion and joining, in a way, kind of quote unquote, joining the rest of the world in realizing that religions are human creations. I'm not advocating that, by the way. I'm just telling you that's what the program is.
Firstly, I'd like to clarify to all our listeners that I'm not a Nazi.
Yeah, there you go.
That was a poor
really
turn of phrase. Yeah, I mean, it's really not what you want to be at the moment, or ever. Really,
you guys do pretty well in the U.S. now.
I'm just saying, yeah, that's it. It's just like it's the time to come out and embrace it over there, it seems. But I was gonna say, it was just like Husnadhan of Indiana Jones. Like let's take out from it the lessons of anti-Nazism and leave the rest of the kind of
not only that,
colonial
but
gaze.
He helps that village, the starving Indian village. Remember, he didn't have to help
that's
them.
it. He
wants to help the children.
Yeah, no, it's a little bit white savior.
And he wanted
white man's
fortune and glory. Fortune and glory.
That's all he wanted.
And then the kids run out in the end. The kids run in the end, and they're so happy, and all the Indians get their kids back.
Because if he was a real colonizer, he would have taken those stones for himself and put them in a museum in London somewhere. Everyone knows that.
Yeah, but the shades, it's like the shades of colonialism.
It would be right now in the.
Well,
London.
Remember, if you remember from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, he does want to put everything in museums. Remember in the beginning when he's a young guy played by River Phoenix, the late River Phoenix, and he says that's the cross of Coronado. It belongs in a museum. And then the guy says, "You lost today, kid, but you don't have to like it." That's a great scene.
I feel left out. I grew up on Bollywood, so I didn't watch I watched a lot of Shah Rukh Khan. So I was in it, but even that, like, I think there's like shades of like, I don't know, even like all kind of Bollywood and Hollywood, they have that essence of the white savior sort of mentality in both. Because I remember even like there was the good Muslim, bad Muslim tropes in even Bollywood. So it's like it's all of it exists.
All the Bollywood Muslim characters look like they're just like evil Maulana characters, like you.
Yeah,
have
and
to
all the
know.
Muslims are terrorists. All the Muslims in Bollywood movies are like terrorists. Most of them.
They're criminals. They're not always terrorists. They're usually criminals, I think, or they used to be.
There's a lot of gangsters as well,
like Agnipath and things like that. And
he knows. I remember Shah Rukh.
I'm a big I like some of the movies. I like Malaika Aurora.
I remember Shah Rukh Khan played like one Muslim guy. I forgot Raiz. I'm like, I go into a movie theater and he's like, yes, he's finally playing a Muslim character. But then first scene is like he's Shia and he's slicing his back. I'm like, oh dear, like this is not the representation I needed.
That was actually.
And he was like he was a alcohol seller as well, or something like, or a drug dealer. So yeah, that made me a bit sad. So.
Maybe want to go visit Gujarat though. It looked like an interesting place. Yeah. But yeah, I was gonna just moving swiftly back. I think another thing I was reading the other day was about the early battles fought by the Muslims against the Sassanids and the Byzantines, and it's so bizarre to think that the Muslims didn't have the 5 daily prayers when there's literal, sources which describe the Byzantines figuring out that if they could attack at Fajr.
Yeah, but you have to
When
understand,
Muslims were
it's not about,
like
you just
during the
have to,
Muslims'
you
prayer,
just
they
have to
actually
understand
identified that.
kind of Orientalist and Neo-Orientalist views is that any Muslim source that goes against your theory can just be discounted as being made up later, right? So this is just made up by Muslims, right? Because to cover up the fact that allegedly, quote unquote, they got the 5 daily prayers from Zoroastrians. I mean, which, by the way, remember, it's not like the Quran says that, like kutiba siyam kama kutiba aladina min qablikum, right? So like we know that there's like the Hajj is pre-Islamic, right? So there's all sorts of things in Islam that come from tradition before Islam. But once it gets affirmed by the Quran and the Prophet, ﷺ, that's Islamically legitimate, right? So what this guy is saying isn't that Muslims had, that their religion incorporates aspects of religions from before Islam. What they're saying is that after the death of the Prophet, that Muslims were like, went out into the Middle East and they were like, oh, we don't really got any prayers. Hey, these Zoroastrians are doing this 5 daily prayers thing. Why don't we do that? That's basically what they're saying, which is ridiculous.
Yeah. Another name that often came up when I actually did I think back in first year of my undergrad, about early Islamic history and Orientalists, and two names that came up were Fred Donner and Patricia Crone. I actually read Patricia Crone's, I think I remember reading the whole book, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. Mm-hmm. And I remember being struck.
That's not actually that bad a book.
No, but I just was struck by how sort of flippantly she dismissed hadith as a like, how can you describe the Muslim tradition without mentioning first and foremost the fact that Muslim, because she basically says all hadith are stories used to elucidate the obscure meanings of the Quran. Because she accepted, I'm fairly sure she accepts the Quran as like a historical source that could be dated to the time. Mm-hmm. But that it was so sort of obscure, even to the Muslims and the Arabs themselves, that they would, sort of create these stories which would become the Islamic tradition and hadith. But how can you do that without mentioning the different and sort of early hadith criticism, hadith scholarship, categorization of hadith? And that was the first thing that struck me. It's like you haven't set up the Muslim sort of position to refute it.
It's easy. Sadly, it's an easy answer. You know what it is? Muslims aren't serious people, right? Muslim scholars are not serious. They don't take Muslim scholars seriously. They're just, unaware, naive pawns or participants in this manufacture of a tradition. And then, of course, the great irony, this is what I consider the real great irony, is that whose books are these scholars using to do all this? It's not like there's other people who are collecting material besides Muslims. This is they're using material that Muslim scholars collected and sifted, painstakingly categorized, preserved, even if they didn't agree with it, right? And then, my favorite is this one Dutch scholar whom I won't mention, but he died of, I think, 2014. Well, why not? I might as well mention him. I talk about it in my books. Joinbull, Gha Joinbull. And he actually wrote about this in my review of his book, but he essentially came to the same conclusion as Krona, that, hadiths are just completely unreliable. But the irony is that he really used almost exclusively as his main source for navigating everything and coming up with his arguments this book by Jamaluddin al-Mizzi, Tuhfat al-Ashraf. And Mizzi died to 742 Hijri, 1342 of the Common Era. And, the guy was literally using if you look at this book, or even any of the books in this genre, you're like, I can't even keep up with this book, let alone I cannot even imagine writing this book now with a computer and searchable databases. These guys wrote these books with nothing, right? Just, paper and their minds. And these books are incredible. They're incredible. They're just stunning. And to sort of to be sort of leaning so dependently on that crutch, not even leaning on it as a crutch, but it's literally the seat you're sitting on to do your work. that you're using, and to be just entirely dismissive and contemptuous of that tradition. That strikes me as there's something fundamentally, I would almost say dishonest, or unaware to the point of dishonesty. It's more of culpable neglect, you know. And okay, look, I have no problem with people doing critical studies of Islamic history. That's fine. I have no problem with this at all. But don't, acknowledge what Muslims did. Acknowledge your debt to them as you do that. It's very simple.
What do you make of someone like Fred Donner as well?
Well, he was my teacher. I love Fred Donner. I mean, I think he's a wonderful person, and I think he's a great scholar. When I was actually in his courses when he was writing his Muhammad and the Believers book, and we had lots of debates, with his students about his theory in the book. I don't agree with the book's theory, and I said that to him, and he was. That's what I'll say about Fred Donner. He's an extremely fair person. I mean, professors are oftentimes like borderline psychologically unstable, usually on some kind of spectrum, and they can be
really?
very.
Sorry, just to add quickly, it's because even with my experience, because my major is finance, funny, but anyways, I all my kind of elective subjects, I made sure I did it in like humanities or philosophy or arts or etc. And I've generally had like pretty good experiences with all my philosophy professors. They're fairly fair and all that.
In grad school, it's different.
Okay, in what way? Can you explain? Because
I mean, it's just you're spending a lot more time with these professors, and they are you're potentially a competitor to them. So my whole point is to say that that Fred Donner is not like that at all. He's you could sit there in class and say, I really don't totally disagree with your theory, and this is why I'm going to give you A, B, C, D points. And he would just say thank you. He would just be very sociable and pleasant about it. And he was very fair. And so we had lots of disagreements about his theories, but he was always a very supportive advisor. He was my advisor, a very supportive professor. And I really benefited a lot from him.
And what do you think was the crux of his sort of theory?
Yeah, for people who don't know or aren't familiar necessarily with his work, could you summarize it briefly, the idea of the Believers movement?
He wrote a lot of books, but his latest book, I think it's his latest book, is Muhammad and the Believers. And if I remember correctly, his theory is basically that Islam starts out as this sort of kind of apocalyptic ecumenical movement of, everybody is like, believe in God, the days of God are coming, the end of the world's coming. And so you can be Christian, you could be Jewish, you could be whatever, and you can kind of just get on board of this sort of belief in God movement, this apocalyptic movement. And the identity of being Muslim as a separate identity really only forms, I think he says, in like the time of Abd al-Malik bin Marwan, so roughly 690s to early 700s. And I had lots of disagreements with him, and other people have noted problems with this thesis. And I think the best examples come from the Quran itself. And we would say, what about this verse where it says, we're Muslims, or we're the, we're the Muslimin, or we're Samahum Muslimin, things like that. Or the fact that you can't just be, as far as I know, there's no evidence in the Sirah that we have, or the Quran, that you could be, let's say, Jewish. I mean, Abdullah bin Salam is Jewish, right? Tamim ad-Dari is Christian. These people are, but then they meet the Prophet, they decide they want to follow him. And then they don't just keep saying, the Prophet doesn't say okay, Friday is now the day we're going to have our communal prayer. And they don't just say well, that's really cool. We think your religion's awesome. We're feeling it, but we're still going to do Saturday, or we're still going to do Sunday as our days of worship. You can't, at no point does anyone actually say to the Prophet, challenge his religious opinion on an issue of faith and practice. If you do that, you're out of the movement. You're not Muslim anymore. You can't. The Prophet defines what Islam is as a religion. You can politically disagree with him about, should we stay in here and have a siege, or should we go out and meet the enemy on the battlefield? And people can have a debate with the Prophet. Islam doesn't care. But in terms of when it comes to deciding what your beliefs are and your worship, there's no evidence that you could say, no, I'm still part of this other community. And so we would have these debates, and and over and over again, whatever evidence you'd say, he would just say, well, I think this verse might be added in later. And so then I said, well, this is problematic because your thesis is based on the idea that the Quran is an early document, which we're going to use to make arguments. But then when evidence goes against your argument, you say, well, I think this verse might have been added later. So that you can't win in this situation. It's loaded or whatever, rigged game. So that's my. But it's been a while since I looked at the book, so I don't want to mischaracterize it. You might want to get someone who's read it.
I had a random thought because you just brought up like the time of Christians and Jews at the time of Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I know it's a bit of a tangent, but I want to get your thoughts as well. I don't think I've heard you speak on it, but there's sort of an interpretation by some. Like I've actually seen. I think I've watched some videos of I think Ben Abrahamson. He's a rabbi. I'm Jewish on YouTube, and I think I follow him on Facebook as well. Where it's like there are a faction of Jews where a percentage of Jews that actually see. I don't know how they view Islam, but it seems like they view Islam as a truth, but they view it as for just the Gentiles, if that makes sense. And so they actually go by the sort of line of thinking where Judaism is for the Jews, so the Jews have to keep following their law, and Islam is for the Gentiles, and I guess that's how they get salvation. But they still, I guess, essentially treat themselves as a special sort of group, but in that sense, they don't dismiss Islam. They sort of accept it as well, if that makes sense. And they actually, I forgot, some of the sort of justifications were pretty interesting in the sense that they would say that Deen isn't Sharia, so they can follow the Jewish law, but they're not sort of, I guess, rejecting Islam either. Like they're just going and following their law. I don't know if you've heard this sort of take, because some people I don't know, may get confused on what Islam's sort of position is on that. So have you heard of this line of thinking before? And what's your thoughts?
No, I've never heard of this. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I just happen not to have heard of it. So I can't comment on it.
I want to draw back to one of the comments you made, because you've given a good rundown for us over some of the major kind of revisionist, like the development of Orientalist scholarship of Islamic or early Islamic history. But you said that there were some problems emerging nowadays that you'd noticed, such as the what did you say, activistization?
It's a progressive.
The activistization of Islamic history. Was that? I don't know. I think that's what you said.
Yeah, I just made up that word. It's not a very good word, but I mean,
that's it. I was sort of stumbling over it, but
no, I think this is. I think I get what you're saying.
I
mean, this is a bigger issue in the academy in general. I think, at least in the U.S. And I think, I don't know about, I said definitely in the humanities and social sciences, which is that it's, there's more and more evidence that there's this trend that, the job of scholars is to be these sort of, kind of activists in the cause of what are presumably agreed upon, agendas of justice and kind of righting moral wrongs of the past, or righting inequities or inequalities. And I just don't, I find that very problematic in the sense that, as far as I understand it, scholars' job is to study and, seek truth and understand their field and make that knowledge, advance the cause of knowledge. And that may or may not facilitate someone else's or even a shared agenda of justice or kind of rectification of wrongs. But I'm not really sure, what are you supposed to do with your scholarship? I wrote this once in a listserv. Someone said, it was actually an Islamic studies listserv, and people were getting very upset at some the very few kind of quote unquote conservative Muslim scholars who were in the academy, and saying, that these people didn't really have a place. They shouldn't be kind of welcomed in the academy because they had views about social issues like LGBT stuff that were unfair and harmful and caused pain to people. And, that that this contradicted the, I quote, academic values of fairness and equality. And I said, look, I can understand if you have like social objectives of seeking fairness and equality, or political objectives, but I'm not really sure what it means to say these are academic objectives, because if let's say I'm a sociologist and I do a huge inductive survey of a massive population of, let's say, Muslims in Australia, and I find out that Muslims in Australia are more likely to engage in acts of violence than non-Muslims, right? And like that's
never gonna happen. But
no, but like imagine I'm the most. I'm using this as an example because
we're pretty relaxed.
I don't want to be called any bad names. I mean, I'm sort of beat up on my own community, right? But I mean, let's say that I use the best. I'm the best sociologist. I use the best methods to do this survey, and I show that Muslims are more violent than non-Muslims. There's a lot of people would say, no, that that can't be accepted. We can't promote this. This type of scholarship cannot be admitted or accepted or brought to the table because it's discriminatory. But I mean, what do you want me to do? I've done my work. I've used the methods of my field properly, and I've come up with this conclusion. Now, if someone wants to challenge the conclusion or discuss why it is, that's fine. But to say that it won't be accepted because it doesn't advance the quote unquote academic objective of fairness and equality strikes me as being really creating a dilemma at the heart of what scholars are supposed to be doing, which is they're supposed to follow the evidence wherever it takes them, not follow the evidence as long as it takes them on a progressive path. And I mean, I say this as someone who's, I'm very active. Yeah, I mean, I'm very active on things like civil liberties. I'm very active on things like criminal justice reform and civil liberties of people who are accused in any situation, whether it's terrorism or other crimes, right? Alleged crimes. And that's different from my academic work. And so I think that you're seeing in a lot of areas a collapsing of activism and scholarship in a way that I think ends up being very harmful towards scholarship.
It's rather stifling of it, and in many ways, it's not conducive at all to an environment of sort of intellectual flourishing, because you're going to, if you take it to an extreme, then I feel as if you're going to actually end up at the point where your ideas can't be questioned. Certain ideas become sort of, even in a critical academic sense. Like I'm personally, for example, using, a case study of like 8th century Baghdad under the Abbasids, sort of critical approaches to Islamic law, philosophy, theology were abundant, and there were critiques of sort of orthodox or largely held positions about what constituted Islam and what was essential, what was Islamic sort of theology. And the thing is that kind of was conducive to the growth of the entire sort of Islamic orthodox Ash'ari and Maturidi schools, because it came out of the environment of having to critique the Mu'tazila. But what I'm trying to sort of hint at here is, don't you feel as if it is something when you start to collapse and to sort of close avenues to discussions and to different positions within an academic context, that it's actually going to render thought and debate sort of anemic in that particular context?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. I mean, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help anybody. And it's also problematic because, we do not have in our societies agreed upon agendas of what justice should look like in society, right? So if you say, I think that, that that in order to be just and fair, someone has to have a certain view towards, let's say, transgender rights. Well, there's lots of people in our society who are reasonable and intelligent and educated and conscientious and good intentioned, and they totally disagree with that. Or they might have a totally different set of idea of what the proper rights for transgender people are. And that's, to pretend that there's some agreed upon vision that we should all be working for as scholars, and that our research should be supporting that or in service of that, I think just ignores a sizable, if not majority, position in these societies, and that's also a very well reasoned one. So I think that it also masquerades as, it sort of reminds me of Muslim scholars in the past when they'd say, like, it's inconceivable that someone could not have the position that our madhab has arrived at. Mm-hmm. So, of course, there's like other major madhabs that don't have that position. Just because you can pretend that your opinion is the only reasonable one conceivable, you can pretend that all you like, but it doesn't mean that it's true.
I wanted to get your thoughts quickly on, you're probably familiar with Juan Cole. Like, what's your opinion of him? Because he seems pretty respectful of Islam in general and stuff. And he even went on to Zaytuna College and did a talk with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And I think he's more of a rejectionist hadith he takes that kind of route. What's your sort of take on him?
This is the whole episode is just, what do you think of this guy?
Yeah,
this guy.
Because it's like Dr. Jonathan Brown's, in academia, so it'd be good to kind of get your insights about these people in particular. Say something, slip up so we can snippet it and it can go viral, inshallah, online. And then tag Juan Cole in the post.
I generally like Juan Cole's work. I actually haven't read his new book, so I don't know. And I actually don't. Not only that, but I don't even know the main argument. And so I'm not trying to get out of answering your question. I just I actually do not have the requisite knowledge awareness to answer the question.
In general, within academia, like we talked about, the sort of activism stuff that stifles discussion. But what about just in general? Like, what do you feel that the direction of? I remember once you've actually recommended people not to take Islamic studies and just study traditionally and stuff like that. But Muslims, yeah, Muslims.
I mean, Muslims who are interested in learning about their religion, I recommend not to do Islamic studies. If they're interested in Islamic history, then they should definitely do it. But not if they want to learn about their religion.
I think it's useful, especially to engage with the kind of main intellectual trends especially in the Western context.
It's useful if you have a background, right? But a lot of the problem is a lot of these Muslims they don't actually, they're doing this to learn about their religion. They go to Sunday school or something, and then they want to learn about Islam, and they go to college, and so they take an Islamic studies class, and then they end up, very disillusioned or confused.
Have you speaking of this is really interesting talking point. Like, I found from my experience, like, alhamdulillah, I had enough grounding because I took a sort of philosophy class that was I forgot the title of it, but it was basically God and Evil, and I think that was like one of the weeks specifically. So I remember like thinking that if I didn't have this grounding of my sort of aqidah, and I feel that even like I would say like I have the sort of basic foundations, but I know many people aren't in my sort of position who would have taken this class. They would have been sort of had so many doubts. Have you found this kind of phenomena where I guess Muslims that are just Muslim and they sort of take these classes, they have their sort of faith shaken by sort of what they encounter in university, especially taking these classes? Have you found this like to be sort of a frequent thing, or is it more a small percentage?
It's sort of tough for me to say because, I mean, maybe when I first started out teaching, I've been teaching for, like 14 years now, So, when I first started out, maybe more so, but since I've come to Georgetown, I mean, I'm pretty open about my religion. I mean, I a lot of times, I mean, I teach my classes from a fair and objective point of view, in the sense that I I don't expect students to accept evidence that is based on faith, or I make arguments using terms and assumptions that non-Muslims would accept, right? But I definitely I'm very open about like a Muslim perspective, and so I think
Yeah,
that
I
if you
read
were
your
to,
My Rate Professors page. Everyone says you're very passionate about what you talk about, which is good, alhamdulillah. So I was doing a bit of
yeah,
stalking.
so well, that's nice. But I mean, so my point is that I think that if a Muslim students take my classes, I think they come away with very clear understanding that the Islamic tradition is one that is like dynamic and has a lot of questions, and like your Sunday school vision might not be accurate, but you don't. It's not a sort of skeptical or depressing one. I think it would be just one that would get you maybe, it's kind of like the Misquoting Muhammad book, where you see that Muslims are engaged in this process of trying to understand their religion sincerely and using usually very good methods. So I think that's they see it as a living issue and as a dynamic one, and not one that you can just kind of easily pigeonhole. But I think so that in that sense, my students who take my classes are probably not getting as the same kind of experience they would have with a someone who was either not Muslim, or who is, like, let's say, a Muslim who is a lot more dismissive of the classical tradition. I mean, a lot of like progressive Muslim scholars, and I think I'm just guessing, but I would guess that maybe the majority of professors now in Islamic studies, I'm just guessing, or at least a sizable minority, are actually probably like progressive Muslims now. They a lot of times these scholars, I don't want to, not all of them, but a fair percentage of them, I mean, really have, I think, quite palpable contempt for the Islamic tradition, and that if you were to study with them, you would be around people who were quite open about their contempt for the world they were studying, and for its makeup and its assumptions and its conclusions.
You reckon they need some tazkiyah, like some Sufism, to fix that up? Well, because
I don't know. I mean,
if that sort of attitude.
I don't know. I can't say what people's problems are. I mean, I don't. I wish I. I mean, I also don't want to pretend like I'm a perfect person in any way. I could use tazkiyah, certainly. But I think that. Yeah. So I think that I think is more of a. I worry more about that now than I do about people taking classes with with like an Orientalist or something. I worry about them taking classes with a Muslim who's going to teach them to really dislike their own religion.
Yeah.
Was your discovery of Islam though not through a kind of Western academic context when you started? What did they call it? College.
I learned about Islam through a Muslim professor who was not. I mean, she used to wear these extremely short skirts. So she was not at all, a kind of hijabi, but she was very passionate about her religion, and she went and she started the class and said, like, I'm going to teach you this. We're going to study this from the perspective of Muslims. So she was just totally upfront about what she was doing, her methodology. And I could do that in my classes too, in theory, but I think people would. I don't know. I don't think it's fair to do that. Maybe in a history class.
I think I remember, on a podcast you spoke about your experience in that sort of early.
Yeah, so I did learn about it in a Western church context. But hang on, Hashim, إيش بدك؟ أنت محتاج الحمام ولا؟ Yeah, أنا عندي الميلانيوم فالكون PJs بتاعي. أوكي، أنا هدي لك يا هاشم، أنا هدي لك البنطلون الكلسون. هذا لا هذا بتاع معدن. هذا خذ هذا
It's not, I guess, all doom and gloom in the Western context.
Wait,
I
what are you
think that's
saying?
essentially it. No, I'm just saying it's not like all doom and gloom in the Western context, but even like what you're saying is like there's some people kind of have their own sort of methodology of doing things, and there's other people that have like a sort of vehemently like sort of against Islam. You sort of have varied perspectives, but does the university sort of crack down on sort of how you should do? Like, I guess you did talk about the sort of censorship in to some degree, but even the sort of methodology, like, do they sort of do a vetting process sort of thing to make sure that this guy isn't too sort of
yeah, well,
what do you
that's
call
an
it?
interesting question.
Sympathetic
I
or
think
empathetic?
I think that when I started out teaching, which was 2006, I was really worried about getting a job as a Muslim. I was worried that, and it was. I think that there was challenges back then. I think that, and I think if you were to go into class and, if you were to go into, not you, but like, if I were to go into class, it'd go, Sharia is the most just system. We should make Sharia the law. I mean, yeah, that it would be a problem, right? But if you're a Muslim and you have like a progressive agenda, then you can go into class and you can really preach that, and it would be totally fine, because you're going along the same current as the society in general, and the kind of certainly the liberal space of the academy. مازن أنت محتاج مساعدة؟ Okay. ثانية واحدة أنا جاي. So yeah, definitely, like, yeah. So, it depends what you're preaching, right? So if you're preaching something that goes with the assumptions and general agreed upon opinion of Western Academy, then you're going to be safe. But if you're doing something that challenges that, or is seen as backward or discriminatory or harmful or dangerous, then definitely you're going to have a lot of problems.
And I think in essence you're
guess.
saying that it's worse now than it was sort of when you were starting uni in terms of that spirit.
No, I wouldn't say. Sorry, I just flushed the toilet, but it wasn't for me. Basically that. No, I don't think it's worse. I think in some ways it's better, because, actually, I don't know how to judge it. I don't know what to say, except to say that it's certainly a much friendlier place for Muslims, but it's a much friendlier place to certain kinds of Muslims, right? So, ironically, if you're a quote unquote, conservative or quote unquote traditional Sunni Muslim, it's probably just as hostile as it ever was, and actually maybe more so. But if you're a liberal or progressive Muslim, then it's infinitely more welcoming than it would have been, let's say, 15 years ago.
What was it in your early sort of interaction with Islamic studies that was particularly inspiring to you? Like everything? Because
what was inspiring to me?
Yeah, I mean, you became an influential.
Else. So I mean, I became Muslim, and I just wanted to learn about my religion more. And I was in a university, and I just assumed that what you did is you took classes on it. So I didn't know anything else. And it wasn't until later that I found out about like traditional, that you could actually go and study traditionally. I just didn't know about that. And also I really learned about Islam from a very kind of, Fazl Rahmanian, Muhammad Abduian, Muhammad Asadian perspective. So I didn't have a lot of, for me, the ulama was sort of this, like, these people who had kind of become obsolete, and they didn't understand that things had to change. And so it wasn't until I really spent time around Muslim scholars that I learned to be more humble, and I learned to appreciate Islamic scholarly tradition a lot more.
Speaking about the sort of Islamic scholarly tradition, I want to ask you about, like, because in your book, right, you talked about essentially how, I think it was more at the beginning, if I recall correctly, where you spoke about how every group sort of latches onto Islam and sort of justifies Islam through that manner. Like, I guess, for example, you'll have HT, guys from HT will be saying, we'll follow Islam, or Ikhwani say, I'm doing this for Islam. But they're essentially like two different groups. Or even I guess even to add to that, nowadays there's this cult phenomena where, you have this sort of far right or alt right sort of crowd that sort of view Islam in through their sort of lens of, it's I don't know, it has a Sharia, it has it wants to build an Islamic state, so it's not as bad, and so some I guess the people who embrace Islam from the far right will view Islam through their way, so it becomes a sort of reductionist take rather than how it is a sort of diverse sort of scholarly tradition, how me and you were sort of talking about it. So how would you sort of navigate the whole aspect of who sort of speaks for Islam and who does what for Islam? Like, are we just sort of left to be like, look, there's so many groups, there's so many people doing different things, it is what it is, like there's not much you can do, or you sort of find that sort of one group that's on the haq, capital T, truth sort of thing, and then kind of let them speak for Islam, if that makes sense. For me, it's like, I'm cool with Ash'ari Aqidah, Sufis. I think they speak for Islam, who are a bit more activist side rather than not pandering to rulers. I don't know. That's just and engages with all sort of ideas in society. So like, what's your sort of take on that? Like, I guess who speaks for Islam and how do we navigate that?
I mean, I tend to try to be as ecumenical as possible. And what I mean by that is that, you don't like, it's a mistake to talk about all these different groups doing different things. There's all these different groups and they actually agree in common on a lot. And what they agree in common is, al-ma'lum min ad-din bid-durura. Those things are known essentially as part of the religion. And they have a love for God, a love for the Prophet, a veneration of the Quran, a veneration of the Prophet, and and as long as people have that, I have no problem dealing with them and learning from them. And where I draw the line is when people become.
What about like far right and ISIS types? Wouldn't they say that as well? Like, how do you sort of navigate that as well? Then,
I mean, what do you mean far right? Like.
I guess what I was talking about more like maybe Muslims that have that sort of far right mentality, or far right people who embrace Islam that still have that baggage of viewing, sort of.
Are you talking about like alt? There's alt types, like who have the ideas of masculinity and
alt Akharite or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I understand their perspective, right? I mean, they have a lot. Their concerns are legitimate. I mean, they say our religion is being watered down. We're basically being gradually forced to accept certain things in society and in moral values that our religion doesn't accept, and that they're very concerned about that. Those are totally understandable and actually totally valid concerns. I have the same concerns. I mean, I don't agree with being as. I don't necessarily think one should be as strident and as caustic as they are all the time. But I mean, I certainly have the same opinions a lot of the time about my worries, for sure.
And I guess to add to that,
I think almost all. I mean, if you went to a super madhabi or a super Sufi, they would have the same concern. You know what these guys are always talking about. You can imagine the things they're always talking about, right? Go find me a Muslim who doesn't also worry about those things. If they're not, then they're usually like a progressive or a super liberal Muslim. And yeah, I get very worried about that. But the idea that the only reason that we associate that with a kind of right is because they're just the most vocal about it all the time, and they get the most attention. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, most Muslims don't agree with that kind of stuff, and they just don't think you should be an asshole about it.
Yeah, and I guess speaking about like, because that kind of goes into politics, like in terms of, because wouldn't you say though, like with those, okay, we're talking about how they sort of united the fact that love of Allah, Rasulullah, etc. But wouldn't you say like each group, how they sort of do active, now I'm talking about like on the ground, like activism, like how they sort of go about doing that sort of activism will manifest differently, and each one will have their own sort of way of doing it, which will cause more harm than good. Like for example, we'll see the sort of the alt walla bros, whatever, like obsession with LGBTQ, and we know the sort of how you got berated by that and all that sort of stuff. And then I don't know, I guess HC will be like khilafa, and it will just manifest differently on the ground. But wouldn't that be like problematic in a sense of achieving a sort of collective good for Muslims, if that makes sense?
I mean, I think that Muslims have to have more of a sense of clarity of purpose, and that's a real problem we have, which is we don't have a clarity of purpose, but I think that actually there's, for example, if let's say HT people, they're out talking about the need for Muslims to have like political unity. I agree with that. That's fine. And then let's say there's people who say, we need to fight against changes in social norms that are anathema to our religion, dangerous to society. Okay, fine. And there's other people who say we need to do tazkiyah and purify our hearts. Okay, that's true. We do need to do that. There's other people who say we need to go and help orphans and go to the border and make sure that, kids don't get put in cages, and we need to be fighting for justice in our societies. Yeah, that's true. None of these things are wrong, right? I mean, I think the problem only comes up when you have things where someone clearly violates certain red lines. And so for me, and it actually was interesting, I was in this meeting with a number of ulama and scholars and kind of community leaders a few weeks ago. And a guy made this really good point. He made this point of, Muslims needing to have more clarity of purpose. And it made me think about what is it that I want? Like, what is it that if I were to say, what is Muslims' purpose? Obviously Muslim purpose is to worship God, but to believe and do good deeds. But, what is our purpose in, let's say, Australia or in the United States or in the UK? And there I would say, I could be wrong about this, and I'm really open to being corrected. But what I kept thinking is, I want to be able to be a fully functioning 3-dimensional human being and citizen, right? I want to be able to talk about what I think is politically good. I want to be able to talk about what I think is socially good and bad. I want to be able to advocate for what I don't want to have my rights as a citizen constrained by someone telling me that it's extreme or that I have to be a certain good Muslim, and that's what I want. So I think
that's possible in the West, though.
Yeah, I think it is. I hope it is. But my point is that look at like a conservative Christian. I don't know if they have this in Australia, but look at like a conservative Christian in the United States. These guys go out and advocate for whatever they want. If they think that the U.S. should go and invade South Sudan to save the South Sudanese Christians from some evil group, they're going to go to Capitol Hill and they're going to start advocating for that. If they think that they don't want to have certain types of things taught in their schools, they're going to go and start advocating for that. If they think that, et cetera, so they'll do whatever they want to do. You know what I mean? They'll push for what they want as the vision of their society and their family and their surroundings. And I want Muslims to be able to be citizens like that.
But you don't fear as if that's kind of never going to be the case, given the lobby of anti-Muslim and just anything really.
Look, that's. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying that's. I was asking myself, what would I like to happen? And I think that's the answer.
Yeah. And in an ideal.
And then why is that important? Because then you can ask yourself the question, okay, where then do we start? You said you were talking earlier about people working at cross purposes. And okay, so let's figure out if that's our objective. Let's figure out how do we use this to help us draw red lines? And I would say that it actually helps us draw red lines. So one of the things like have always been very vocally against is this sort of agenda MBZ, I call it, the UAE agenda, right? And it's not because I don't like the UAE or something. It's because the UAE government has put major American and European and probably Australian Muslim organizations, mainstream Muslim organizations in the West, has put them on its terrorism list, and it has advocated for the UK and the US and other countries in the West to put these groups on their terrorism lists as well. They are trying to get regular American Muslims locked up, right? And that's like, look, that's we can that is beyond the pale. That's unacceptable. And they're obsessive about this agenda, and they push it everywhere. And they get everyone who works for them and who's indebted to them and who sucks from their teat to push this agenda too. So that's where you say, whoa, this is problematic. Okay. If someone's saying,
how do you sorry, just to add quickly, because we know, like, as much as me and Ralph have talked about how much we've have a lot of respect for Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, but then when he has these sort of ties with UAE specifically, like, how do you take that on board? Like, you'll see scholars that essentially have these sort of ties, and it makes you kind of confused in the sense that, like, these guys are very respectable, but why are they doing this? Like, how do you navigate that in general when it comes to holistically as a Muslim community, considering the amount of power they have and reach they have as well?
Well, I think one aspect of it is, what exactly are you looking to these people for? So, for example, the people that I studied with the most in Egypt, and one scholar in particular, I spent like so many hours and months and months and months, like, with just me and him studying, is this a scholar, Osama Mahmoud in Egypt. And another scholar I didn't spend as much time with, but was a big influence on me, Ali Juma in Egypt. And their politics I completely disagree with their. They're like deep Sisi supporters, and I completely disagree with that. But these people they're alamas. They're incredibly knowledgeable. They're some of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. And I just recognize that they have their reasons. I actually wrote about this in the introduction of the second edition of my book on Hadith. I wrote about this. And you just like the Sahaba, they've fought wars against one another, and they physically killed one another. But they were all doing what they thought was right, and they each had their own arguments, and they just disagreed with these other arguments. And the consequences were severe in this life, but it doesn't amount to saying that someone is not a Muslim, or that they don't know anything, or that they're not knowledgeable, or that they don't have other things to offer. So I think that's one thing. But those people are distant, right? I mean, they're not in the United States. And when we're talking about in the United States, or let's say in Australia, then there's an aspect of, I don't get fatwas from those people, because I consider them, unfortunately, a lot of them to have been, politically, that
compromised.
They're servants. I mean, if it's something like, Sheikh Ali Juma gives a fatwa on, the najasa of, like frogs or something like that. I mean, then that's I don't know how you politicize that, but
no, it's going to be
but I mean,
well thought.
That they're very clearly politically subservient to certain agendas.
Do you really find it something that's easy though, or something that's possible to justify how they could consider it to be in the best interests of Islam and Muslims?
Look, here's the thing. Either these people are monsters, in which case, how can we ever justify or make sense of taking anything from them, right? Or we have a serious disagreement, but that disagreement only involves a certain sphere of life, and it doesn't involve other spheres of life, and it doesn't involve other areas of knowledge. And so we can take from some areas and leave others. And I think that's just undisputedly actually the Sunni position. Nusalli wara kulli bir wa fajr. Pray behind, and lana khayruhu wa lahu aibuhu. These are good positions. And it's very hard for me to say that. I mean, I'm very passionate about some of these things, and I've toiled and cried over them and worried and tried to make sense of things as much as the next guy. But this
and
is
you're yeah, that's it. And you're very you're far more mature and level-headed than a lot of us younger zealous types as well. So
but it's
the fact that it's difficult for you,
someone like Sheikh
Don't
Hamza.
sell yourself short, Raf.
You guys are so someone like Sheikh Hamza. I really, I mean, I have a lot of respect for him, and it's fun. It's interesting. I have a lot of. I feel really close to him in a way. He reminds me a lot of my father. It's weird. I feel like we have a very similar background, me and him. So I feel a lot of closeness to him, and I think he's really important. I think he's done a lot of good work in his life. I think he has a lot to offer. And I disagree with him, and I've had this conversation with him many times about the UAE and about even and recently. I said I think that this Forum for Peace, I think that they're exploiting you. I think that they're abusing you. I think that they're threatening your legacy.
So you've said this like sort of to his face already.
Yeah, many times. But I mean,
what's his sort of response? Unless it's like a secret
I mean,
conversation.
he has.
But
I don't know how. I mean, he has a lot of respect for Abdullah bin Baya, who's his teacher, and I think that. I mean, I would not be surprised that this last thing, with the whole Palestine. I mean, look, I obviously don't support the UAE's decision on Palestine, but on Israel, but. Let's just okay. Let's just say people can debate whether or not the UAE should have diplomatic relations with Israel. Okay, let's just set that aside. But this organization made this announcement about its support for this deal, with the pictures of all these scholarly advisors saying that they had all, that the forum had agreed to support this. When several of these people immediately wrote and said, "We were not consulted on this at all. And we absolutely don't support it." And then, of course, okay, everybody makes mistakes, but they should have immediately issued a clarification or a retraction. They didn't. In fact, as far as I know, they've refused to. I've only heard this privately. But so I think that this means that one cannot have a relationship with such an organization, and I would not be surprised if Sheikh Hamza were to distance himself from that organization on this basis, because that's very hard to turn a blind eye to.
But like, I guess when we go down this route, so I guess it kind of goes back to my earlier point where we're just sort of sifting through things where we're like, okay, we take it from this scholar, we don't take this from the scholar, we take this position from the scholar, but I guess politically we don't align with him, etc., etc. You're sort of just on your own, like at the end of the day. So how can you really have like a collective sort of Muslim community?
Like you're always
look,
you get what I mean? You're always on your own. I mean, in the sense that in the end, you have to make a decision about what you listen to and what you don't listen to. There's no escaping that. But I think that you try to be as I said, as ecumenical as possible. You try to give as much husn adhan as possible. You try to be as open to the jama'ah and as welcoming to other Muslims and as helpful to them and to allow them to help you as possible. But then you just have to figure out what your red lines are and then what kind of red lines those are, right? So when I say that things like pushing the UAE agenda in the West is a red line, right? Or breaking like BDS, or consciously breaking BDS is a red line for me. That's a red line politically and kind of communally, but it doesn't mean that I don't think people are Muslims or that I don't see them as having value or that I don't, still want to read their books or something. I mean, like Abdullah bin Baya's books, Sheikh bin Baya's books, some of his books are incredible. I mean, I like some of his smaller writings on the concepts like al-Haja wa Darura Shar'iyya. I mean, they're amazing. They're just exceptionally high quality scholarship. They're just head and shoulders above everything else written on the subject, in my opinion. So I would never stop reading those books or even recommending that people read those books. I would always recommend them to people. Even though I very openly would say that I think that he's become a servant of a tyrannical government that is harming the cause of Muslims and damaging their rights in an unacceptable way.
Yeah, like just to add quickly, me and Raf, we know someone that sort of, let's just say, keep it kind of vague, has sort of loose connections with the UAE government. So he was just telling us that essentially they're just, it's like Islam to them is just okay, we'll go and pray. But when it comes to sort of getting the sort of I don't know, the material wealth or getting power, it goes like they do all they can essentially. Like it's sort of like a sort of way that they sort of perceive life
Yeah,
is
I
just
mean,
completely different to how
I
we
under,
sort of perceive. You know what I
but
mean?
again, let's be as open and as um, charitable as possible, right? So let's just say, you know what? Let's say you have a friend who all he does is pray, and the rest of the time he's just trying to make money. He's okay, fine. That's, you know what? Okay, you want to do that with your life? That's fine. You don't care. Religion for you is just prayer 5 times a day. Alhamdulillah. But if then that person starts doing something like working for the government to try and put you in jail, then you're like, hey, man, like this is not acceptable. So I think that's really where one has to start.
Shout
That's
out to
for
all the
me.
anti-CVE activists in Australia as well, because that literally happens here.
Yeah, so like something like working in CV. Now, if someone says, like, I'm very open in the sense that if somebody says, like, for example, the U.S. government comes and says to me, we want you to come and give a presentation to, Donald Trump about, well, I don't want to use Donald Trump because he's obviously a terrible person. But I mean,
He's
if
across the red line, yeah.
yeah, but like, because I just don't think this person is sincere in any way, right? But let's say Barack Obama, right? President Obama, during Obama, if he wants you to come and give a presentation to President Obama about, Islam and Muslims and stuff like that, of course I would go do it, right? I mean, I would go do it and I would go say what I thought was correct and right. And if they got angry at me, and they would say, okay, well, I did my duty. And if they said, well, we're never going to invite you back, you're going to be persona non grata in Washington D.C. for the rest of your life, I'll say, okay, no problem. But so I mean, I don't have a problem with, let's say, working with governments. I mean, these governments, after all, are funded by our tax dollars. There are governments, but there's certain, when you have certain programs like CVE, which are clearly designed to and function to um, criminalize Muslims and limit Muslims' rights to be fully fledged citizens and human beings in our societies, then you can't tolerate cooperation with those agendas, with those programs.
What's your sort of opinion? Like, I guess I want to get your thoughts about, there's the whole sort of approach to create that sort of change on the ground in terms of activism. Like, are you the type to, like, for example, you'll have like KC be like, nah, like no voting, and that sort of already restricts the sort of change they can make on the ground, like on a sort of voting level and getting the right people in power. And then I guess a lot of UK people are like, look, we have so many kind of Muslim MPs, but they just only I think I read today as well, I think I forgot the name of the person, but they're pretty much a Israel lobby, essentially like a Muslim MP. So, and that's like a common, I don't know how common it is in the UK, but that's a sort of recurring theme that they don't really serve the interests of Muslims. And then you have people like critique Ilhan Omar. I think you tend to view her somewhat positively in the sense that at least she's, anti-Israel and she can have that approach openly, but people are like, oh, she's dancing with gays or whatever, so it's not really
I mean,
serving the sort of.
I don't want to act like, I don't want to say, I like her because she's anti-Israel. I'm not. I don't have. It's not like
My enemy is my friend.
That's a good starting point.
My point is, I don't think that people should have their land taken from them, and that they should be treated like second-class citizens and imprisoned and shot with impunity, and driven from their homelands, and I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong wherever it happens.
Of course.
Okay, and
Definitely.
so that's my issue with the Israeli government and with Zionism.
Of course.
If
Yeah.
so, I'm happy that Ilhan Omar speaks out on that, and I'm happy that she's a Muslim, and I'm happy that she wears hijab, and that young Muslims can see her and see that that's something they can be proud of and they can aspire to, is to be a leader in their countries, and a positive image of their religion to other people, right? Now, I don't agree with some of the stuff Ilhan Omar says and does, and I've said that to the extent that I could reach advisors of her. I have said that privately, and I've said so politely, publicly. But I mean, and but I mean, I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, beyond that, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. I mean, I don't obviously support everything she does, and I don't condemn everything she does. I try to evaluate things based on the merits.
So basically, like, I guess my question would be, what approach would you take to create change? Would you just kind of rely on the system, get the right, Muslims into the system and try their best to make change? Because I guess people will make the argument that the system is the problem, but it's not like we can just come in and change the system per se.
Well,
so
I think
what's your sort of take?
People would talk about, I mean, look, I'm not a community organizer and I'm not a politician, and I don't, so I'm way outside of my area of expertise when I say this. I just can tell you what limited insight I have. But this is not my, I mean, I'm no wiser than you two on this issue, right? Maybe even less wise. I would just say that, you need to have both, as some people would say, like Malcolm and Martin. You have to have, you have to kind of rattle the bars and the streets to expand the limit of thinkable thought. But you also need to participate in a system, because once the range of thinkable thought is expanded, you have to pursue and promote an agenda within using the existing institutions, right? So I would say that, actually, if you take an example of someone like Ilhan Omar, you actually have a pretty, I think, good example, which is that, 10 years ago, I mean, you could probably even go 6 years ago, but let's say 10 years ago, it would have been, by the way, I've been making a bed the whole time talking to you. So if you hear like weird ruffling and stuff, it's because I'm making beds. It would have been inconceivable if you'd asked me like 6 or 7 or 10 years ago, was there going to be a hijab wearing, BDS supporting Muslim congresswoman in Congress, or even a Palestinian, another Palestinian one? I would have been like, you're crazy. No way. And what's changed? I mean, did something within the system change? No. What happened was, at least as I understand it, I could be wrong, that suddenly there were like all these videos of black men getting shot randomly by the police. And people started to realize that some of the things that they'd always thought were impossible were actually happening all the time. Namely, that American law enforcement was shooting innocent people. And once you start talking about it, once you start really talking about critiquing the system, the justice system, once you start really talking about questioning the kind of the orthodox narrative, then things start to become possible. Then what happens, right? For whatever reason, this orange-headed idiot, this like disgusting narcissist who, like, I would just be mortified if I even existed anything close in the shape, form, anything close to what Donald Trump lives like every day. This guy becomes president, right? And suddenly, a guy, because he hates Muslims so much and says so often, right, that suddenly anybody who, you hugging Muslims and supporting Muslims becomes acceptable in a way that had never been before. So someone like Ilhan Omar is able to become a congresswoman because the range of thinkable thought has moved sufficiently due to these circumstances that were not sort of manufactured within that system. In fact, they came from outside that system. Does that make sense?
A lot of people are saying, and I actually intended to ask you this, but we jumped straight into the deep end with the questions. But what is the sort of zeitgeist over there at the moment? What do you feel about
Well, the
American
zeitgeist for me
society
is
and
basically my house. I don't. It's not like I'm out on this. You need to talk to people who are like out on the street. You got to talk to people who are out on the street.
But you're
I
probably
do,
more aware than I am.
I do have Trump supporting white friends that I talk to on the phone. My wife gets really angry about that. But I mean, these are like some of my really oldest friends. So I talk to those guys, and it's really interesting to hear their perspective. And I don't know. I think, I mean, I guess I can only tell you what I sense, but I mean, I think that, yeah, it's a real, well, you have like two totally different spheres. And this is well known now about like the effects of social media and everything that, like my friend, one of my friends who I talk to, a really good friend of mine who's, a Trump supporter, he thinks that, he calls like Ilhan Omar. He's like, he's got a lot of, let's just say he uses a lot of bad words, right? For AOC, a lot of bad words. And, he thinks Democrats are insane. And he's not a religious guy. He's not even a particularly conservative guy. He just thinks that the progressive agenda and Democratic Party has basically gone bonkers. And that he's like, and, when you have things like, what was this thing that happened? It happened recently. Like when if he heard something like abolish the police, he would just laugh and say, that's insane. You can't abolish the police. If you want to talk about reforming the police he would just, he thinks that the Democratic Party is basically hostage to this extreme left-wing agenda. And he's
and a lot of Muslims feel that way too, though.
Yeah. So, that's why, that's actually completely true. But he doesn't, for him, thinking like, then, there's people, obviously, we know lots of Muslims who are very progressive and completely kind of enwrapped in that worldview. These two people just cannot comprehend each other's existences. And I think that's probably the single most glaring and dangerous feature of our time, is the inability to acknowledge the reasoning or concerns of the other, but only to see them as so completely complicit in evil, in an intolerable evil that
I suppose that's why they call it the sort of cultural war.
They can't be tolerated. Yeah.
And I've seen Muslims who sit on either side of, like, pretty much copy paste either side of this political kind of divide, where you'll have Republicans supporting Muslims in the US context, citing the progressive agenda, and then you'll have Democrat inclined Muslims. Everyone knows this, but Democrat inclined Muslims who cite the sort of pro-Israel and anti-Muslim rhetoric of the Republican Party, among other things, as justification for their tendency towards the Democratic Party.
Both those groups are right. Like, both of those points are totally correct
and problematic for a Muslim.
I mean, both of those, like, these two choices are not choices you want to make. Like, I mean, neither of these choices are desirable.
So what do you sort of advise for people who are sort of caught up in this dichotomy and either side of the divide?
Before, I guess, Doc answers, I want to get your thoughts quick, Raphael, because I guess in the Australian context, you see like a sort of a reflection in our sort of politics as well.
Well, in spite of my comments before, which may have indicated that I'm a Nazi, I am in fact a radical leftist, and a bona fide socialist. But so I'm definitely going to be biased. I'm joking, sort of. But no, I certainly have a bias towards, because of my family context, like center left and left wing politics. Just, I grew up very, very skeptical and very, very sort of loathsome towards the right wing parties because of their sort of tacit and sometimes explicit racism, and that was something that I could never stomach. And yes, there's sort of tacit racism from center left parties as well, but they generally do a lot better than the right. So as a Western perspective, I think that it's more beneficial. But that's the context here. I'm sort of there is a party in Australia that is going to approve the construction of your mosque, and there is a party in Australia that is going to be far more inclined to deny you that capacity to exist as a community.
Just to add quickly, like, wouldn't you find, like, especially minority communities where essentially, like, we're trying to achieve change to some degree for Muslims to better our situation, but what's happening from a political point of view, whoever's a politician, is that they're looking at the Muslim community as pawns to get to, you know, I think Joe Biden's an example. People will maybe say that he's trying to,
and no party, honestly, man, like, even though I said that I have my bias and whatever, everyone has their bias. I'm just aware of mine, so that makes me, you know, able to say it. But no party actually has a monopoly on the interests of Muslims. No party. Both.
It's like, how do we get out of that kind of you know, sort of problem where they're just looking to us as pawns? Because, like, for example, I'm going to Eid prayer, and literally before we start our salah, it's like a politician's there and then gives a speech.
They have to show up to win the hearts and minds.
It's a politician's khutbah.
It's like the Vietnam War doc, you know, with the winning the hearts and minds of the people.
What's the Muslim percentage of the Muslim population in Australia?
Well, in Sydney, it's over 5% now, I think, or there and thereabouts. In our particular council area or our particular district, that number is between about 15 and 50%, depending specifically on where you are. So we're in the Muslim-dominated area now, but across all of Australia, I think it's about 2.5 to 3%.
Interesting. So, yeah, sort of between the US and UK.
Literally right in between, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I don't know the answer to this question. But I mean, on certain issues, I mean, look, I guess in some ways you have to ask yourself, what do you want your country to look like in 50 years, you know?
Khilafah.
How do you work for that, I guess? But, you know, to be honest, I actually don't know the answer to that question. I do not know the answer. So I can't.
I've always felt that we need to try and figure out how to establish ourselves here as some kind of distinct and autonomous political entity for the sake of, maybe for people who come from recent migratory, recent migration and who come from migratory backgrounds, like their parents are migrants or they're migrants themselves, they may not understand that. But 2 generations down the line, when you're raising Muslim children who have no recollection of any land or language beyond, you know, being Anglophone and living in a Western country, I think that it's very important to embrace some kind of, and I think the Americans are a bit better at it than us, to embrace some kind of idea of an indigenous identity. That
like Sheikh Abdul Murad says.
Yeah, but that doesn't, because when you say like, oh, Australian Muslim, we have to be Australian Muslims, like, it has just blatantly CVE undertones from the context in which I've heard those phrases before. You know, to be an Australian Muslim means to be apolitical, or to be like subservient to like the secular conceptions of the place of religion and sensibilities. I think Dr. Salim Farah at Sydney Uni, big shout out, great scholar, talks about how there's like the Muslim discourse doesn't fall within the realm of public reason, according to the Western definition of what is like public reason. Or I think those are the 2 words that he uses. But yeah, there's a sort of reasonable discussion that can take place.
Sounds about right.
And it's, I guess, how we do that is the question.
If anyone can solve that, then they'll be the mujaddid of this era, though. Like, you know, seriously.
Yeah, that's true. Guys, I got to put these kids to bed. No, I mean, literally like children to bed, not figuratively.
I thought you meant us. I'm like, look, we're young.
I gotta go take care of domestic duties.
No, and you're a paragon of this kind of domesticity.
How long have we been on the phone or on the?
Like hour and a half.
Okay, that's pretty good. I don't feel too guilty. I've put in. I've pulled my weight.
You certainly put in a shift, and we appreciate it.
Question though.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can't recall, but I remember, like, you know how everyone in Muslim Twitter kind of, or Muslim Facebook rile up about Amina Wadud. I don't know much about her, but all I hear about her is the deadbeat dad situation
Mhm.
thing. So I'm expected to cancel her, yeah. But I remember you saying, like, you mentioned some of her stuff were decent. Like, I don't recall though. I don't know if I've misinterpreted what you said. But what's your sort of take on her? I think you've done a bit more reading into her, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've read a couple. I've read, I think, two of her books. She might. I don't know if she has more books. I read Inside the Gender Jihad, and then this one I think called The Quran and Women or something. And I mean, if you read them, like, there's some like value. I mean, there's a lot of, she asked some real questions about what does it mean that women don't seem to have been, um, certainly not equal participants in elaborating understandings of what it means to be Muslim. I think that's a fair question. Certainly
Okay. Yeah.
something you need to have an answer for. If you don't have an answer, you're not going to be able to answer some questions that people have. And but I mean, I was, when that thing happened with the deadbeat dad, it's funny because I actually wrote a Facebook comment trying to kind of be charitable towards her and saying, I think that she probably just misspoke and she should just
Mm.
clarify it. But then she doubled down, and it was, yeah, I don't. I mean, and I think that she's, probably, more harmful than beneficial to Muslim community and to the ability of Muslims to understand and identify with their religion in a positive way. I think she's, um, yeah. So I wouldn't, I did my best to give her a chance to to clarify herself to others, and I mean, I'm not acting like I'm some kind of important person, but I mean, I did what I tried to do. But I've never, since then, and that was a couple of years ago. I haven't seen anything that would make me ever want to include her in any kind of discussion about what it means to be Muslim.
Because what I found, like every time I guess I talk to sort of a quote unquote like traditionalist, where like if we were open to have the kind of discussion or conversation about, oh, I don't know, did our tradition in the past really incorporate, I guess, there, I guess not sort of saying they didn't, but it's kind of opening the conversation of, I guess, women in those circles, and I don't know, at times where they sort of included Muslim women and scholarship and sort of including in the whole discussion. I guess they're very adverse. It's like the first thing is like, are you trying to depict our scholars of the past as misogynist? And it kind of shut down the conversation because they sort of look to the scholars in such respect, which is obviously deserved, but at the same time, it's like it stifles discussion. Have you had that kind of experience in general as well? If you know what I'm alluding to.
Um, Sorry, can you clarify that more?
Okay, so essentially, because for example, by the time this episode released, we would have released an episode with Dr. Asim Yusuf, and I guess my conversation there, what I asked him was about, I guess, did our scholars in the past kind of exhibit aspects of, what we deem in this day and age to be racism and misogyny, right? Which in their context would have been in that category. So I guess the sort of feminist scholars kind of talk
Mm,
about, I guess, the
yeah, I
inclusion
understand what you
of
mean.
women
Yeah,
at times. You get what I mean?
I mean, in some ways, I think this conversation is rigged. I'll tell you why. Because I mean, according to the kind of current moving frontier of what it means to be racist or sexist or misogynist, right? People who were totally normal 10 years ago were racist and sexist and misogynist. I mean, so I think that just, even people within the like the last decade, the definitions have changed so much and the standards have changed that, I just think about, and of course, there's nothing to make you think that it won't continue to change in the future in the next 10 years. So how can you even have these conversations? Because these these labels are damning, right? They clearly exist, or they clearly call for the person to be, problematized to the extent of cancelment, right? Cancellation. usually. But they're also constantly moving and constantly sucking up more of the past. So you get kind of what you might call like outrage. It's almost puritanical, and this sort of inflation. It's like currency inflation or something, where these concepts just end up becoming more and more expansive. So I think in some ways it's just I don't even want to get in that discussion, because if you can't even take people 10 years ago seriously because you think that they're sexist or racist or whatever, then how can you possibly have a real link to your own past that is healthy and productive and that allows you to connect to the wisdom of our ancestors?
And just to add quickly, like, what about like the whole idea of, even like slavery? And I know you've written a book on it and all that, but how would you explain that in the sense that, look, our scholars in the past, or even may have advocated for slavery in the sense that it's part of the Islamic tradition, but it's like nowadays in this day and age we don't adhere to that. So it's not like, I guess in this current context, we're not going to be like, we want slavery back kind of thing, you know what I mean? So like I'm just using that as an example to kind of look back at
you want me to in the 1 minute before I have to put kids to bed, you want me to summarize the entire issue of slavery? That's not gonna
pretty much.
That's not gonna happen, buddy. You can just give them a link to my book or some talk I gave. I don't know.
Plug it, yeah. It's available.
We get commission. For it.
No, but I mean that's the reason I wrote about that book or wrote about that topic. It's precisely because of this, because of the problem it presents. I mean, it's so.
There's a lecture, by the way, everyone who's listening, on YouTube.
Yeah, the one with Yasser Qazi. I think that's a good lecture.
Yeah, brilliant lecture.
But anyway, so my point is that like these, I think that it's just I don't want to say it's a trap, but it's just like a rigged discussion. Once you get into that discussion, you've accepted terms that are inevitably going to force you to alienate yourself from your past. And if your past sucks, then that's probably good. But if your past is one that you venerate as connecting you to divine truth, then you better be careful.
Yeah, I think a lot of like I've found as well, like Muslims, they just like, I guess it's kind of like all groups kind of do it. Like HT, I guess maybe not explicitly, but the caliphate, it's amazing, this and that, but it was like a tumultuous history with that. So it's about not looking, it's also being critical, but also level-headed and knowing that, I guess, the Quran and Sunnah is the truth, and we're just trying to navigate in this day and age, I guess, essentially. Like that's how kind of my approach is, because before I was like, caliphate will solve all our issues, but then if anything, probably caliphate may be worse at times. Isn't that right, Raphael? Like,
oh no, that's not like what I said.
We've had this discussion before. Like, wasn't it like the caliph had like homosexual tendencies?
Yeah,
imagine that in this day and age.
That Muslims
would get heart attacks.
Muslims would not have a great conception of what Islamic government post Rashidun.
Now I really gotta go to bed.
But you've got a response to this. We appreciate you giving us part of your time.
I'm not trying to interrupt the discussion, but
fair enough. We'll see you at the Boys in the Cave Patreon WhatsApp chat, inshallah. This is Dr. Brown's in it. So
tell me when this episode comes out.
Yeah, I'll keep you posted, inshallah. But yeah, Jazakallah khair. As I mentioned to the audience, Dr. Jonathan Brown's in the chat, so you guys donate to our Patreon, inshallah, and you can have a chat with him. Continue the discussion.